Hi, I'm Brandy Payne. I'm a workplace mental health consultant, which means that I help teams to beat stress and burnout in the workplace so that they're mentally healthier, happier, more resilient, and better able to do their jobs in front of them. Today, I am joining you to talk about avoiding and managing burnout through a mental health at work plan. So, before we get too far into the conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about what these different terms mean. We use the terms burnout, anxiety, stress, and overwhelm like really a lot in our day-to-day lives. And they tend to have a bit of a clinical meaning, like an official meaning of what they are. But at the same time, I think the important piece is really how they appear for you and how they feel for you. So, for example, while the technical term for burnout is feeling exhausted, depleted, and mentally distanced from your job as a result of chronic unmanaged stress, feeling like you're just kind of done with all of the things is a great example of burnout. Likewise, anxiety has a particular definition, but a lot of us feel different bits of anxiety and worry in different parts of our lives. Stress, that's the biological reaction to a potential threat. A lot of that happens below our level of consciousness, and it's our body and brain's natural reactions to stressful situations or potential threats. And then overwhelm, well, that's just when our work and expectations tend to outweigh the amount of time or energy that we have to accomplish them in. Now, I want to focus a little bit more on the feelings of burnout because for a lot of people, especially these days, that's the one that really comes in strongly when we're talking about mental health at work. So, some of the things that can lead to that is feelings like we're, expecting too much of ourselves, or feeling like maybe we're in a role that's not a good fit for us, either as a person or because of our experience. Like maybe that sense that we're not quite good enough at our jobs, and then we end up working harder to prove ourselves. Sometimes lack of control in our work environment can also have a big role, as can, the work environment itself, one where it's like really chaotic, lots of things always happen, or on the opposite end of the spectrum where it's really monotonous and really dull. That can also be contributed to by a sense of an imbalance between our work lives and our personal lives, which, in modern times is really challenging with many people working from home. At the end of the day, though, and one of the most common reasons for burnout is a sense of unmanaged and uncontrolled stress that we're experiencing. So later on, we're going to talk a little bit more about managing stress and stressors so that we can help to avoid that feeling of burnout. Some of the common signs and symptoms of burnout are feeling really exhausted, run down, constant feeling of stress, and sometimes that feeling of like, if everyone could just leave me alone, I could get all my work done. So that sense of, more irritability or frustration with those around us, whether that's at work or at home. There also can be some physical symptoms like increased headaches and others. Now, the reason that this matters is that unmanaged stress can have a huge impact on us, both in terms of our performance and our well-being. So, in terms of performance, when we're in a stressful situation, our physiological responses kick in. So that's when, heart rate goes up, the fight or flight response kicks in. And in a lot of ways, we move from our thinking brain, like our prefrontal cortex, into that more reactive part of our brain, because this is our body's response to try and keep us safe from imminent danger and a big threat. It shuts down our higher level thinking. It impacts our memory. We're more likely to make mistakes, and we just aren't really thinking as clearly. This can also impact our ability to work with those around us. It also impacts our well-being. So that heightened sense of awareness also means that our body has shut off any work that isn't absolutely critical for survival. So for example, your muscles are tightening, blood flow is going to your muscles so you can like escape the situation or fight your way out of it. But what that also means is that, our digestive system takes a pause. Our immune system is temporarily heightened, but a prolonged stress experience can actually have a negative impact on our immune system long term, and has been linked to chronic immune related illnesses like autoimmune disorders. It also leads to higher levels of blood pressure and many other health concerns. So ultimately, it's not good for our physical health or our mental health. It also means, again, more frustrated, more irritable, and also makes us more prone to things like burnout and overwhelm and other problems like that. Ultimately, though, and I think this is the most important part, it's really just a crummy way to live. It's not fun to live in a state of constant stress and constant overwhelm. And so that's why we want to think about some of the things we can do to support ourselves. So, how do you prevent burnout? Well, the key piece is to manage both parts of stress. So, I was describing what the stress response looks like in our bodies. And that, again, it's the way that our bodies and our brains react to stress. That is one piece of burnout, or pardon me, one piece of stress. The other piece of stress is the stressor itself. So, those are the things, the events, whatever's happening in our life that causes us to feel that level of stress, the thing that sets off the stress response. Some of the common stressors that we see, and frankly, these can apply for home life as well as work life, but we see them a lot in our workplaces. One of them is workload. So feeling like there's not enough time to get the work that we need to get done, as well as maybe, a lack of communication around priorities, not feeling like you have influence over the work you're doing or how you're doing it. And then also feeling like you can't talk to anyone about your workload concerns. So feeling like you're just kind of stuck dealing with it. And if you tried to raise the concerns, it wouldn't go anywhere. That can be a big stressor. And work relationships are another big area. So whether that's your immediate supervisor or your boss's boss, or people that are in your immediate team or that you're working with on projects, they have a huge impact on your amount of stress at work. One of the things that can act as a mitigating factor to minimize some of that stress is having friends at work. Those folks that you have a friendly relationship with that you can talk to about your concerns, even if they're really just there for a supportive ear. But ultimately, the way that people treat each other in your workplace is going to have a big impact on whether or not work relationships are a source of stress for you or not. The third piece is the culture of your workplace. So, do you feel like you're part of a team, or is it one of those every person for themselves kind of environment? Do you feel like you can have honest and truthful conversations with people, or is it going to be used against you? Those sorts of things can have a huge stress on our ability to work with one another and how we are able to navigate our workplace. Another piece is like, what are the spoken and unspoken norms, or the written and unwritten rules of your workplace? For example, how are breaks treated in your workplace? For a lot of organizations, there's a written rule about breaks are encouraged. Make sure you take your lunch break. But the unwritten rule is that it's frowned upon to leave your desk. So those sorts of things can have a huge impact, especially when we think about the way that being able to take a break and step back from work can really help us to manage some of our stressors and our stress response. So when we're dealing with stressors, there's a couple of steps that I recommend to take. One of them is to identify the root cause. Sometimes the thing that we feel in the moment as the stressor, the thing that causes our stress response, isn't the actual underlying cause or the actual problem that we're facing. And so, for example, at home, if my kids leave the cap off the toothpaste and something lands on the toothpaste and it spills everywhere and there's a big mess. If I'm having a crummy day and I've had a rough day at work, I may be having an argument with my partner, in that instance, I'm going to have a really strong stress response to the toothpaste. Whereas if I was having a nice, normal, happy day, probably wouldn't have been such a big deal. Probably just would have cleaned it up, reminded the kids to put the lid on the toothpaste, that kind of thing. So in the example of the toothpaste, the stressor isn't the toothpaste so much as it's the other things going on, the things that maybe caused the fight with my partner, the things that are causing stress at work. So looking at what those underlying factors are and what you can do to minimize that stressor. So some stuff we can eliminate by talking it through with trusted colleagues or folks at work. Other things, we can't really change it. For example, if your boss is one of your sources of stress, not going to be able to change your boss, but you might be able to change how you interact with your boss and how you're able to manage how you respond to that individual or things that you do to support yourself after challenging interactions with that person. So looking at what's changeable and what isn't. Now, later in this conversation, I'm going to share a link that you can go to download a workbook that's going to walk you through the steps for identifying these root causes and identifying what's changeable. So look out for that. Really recommend checking it out. So the next piece is, if you can do something to support yourself, for example, or minimize the impact, one of the examples I like to give is, if you're on your way driving somewhere and suddenly traffic jam, and now you're going to be late, your stress response kicks in. The stressor there was the fact that this traffic jam is causing you to be late. So one of the things that you can do to minimize that stressor, like we can't control what's going to happen with traffic. But what we can control is maybe planning our day to give ourselves a longer time period to get there. We can also, make a difference by perhaps calling the person we're supposed to be meeting with and letting them know that we may be running late due to this traffic jam. So those are some ways that you can minimize the impact on you for that stressor. When we're looking at things that are changeable, it's really important to plan out how that conversation is going to go. Often we have to have a sometimes awkward or potentially difficult conversation with someone in our life in order to address those stressors. And so thinking through what that conversation is going to look like. Identify what the problem is, identify the stressor and the ways in which it's harming you or harming the relationship. And then look for some potential solutions. So identify those out ahead of time so it's easier to walk through them in the conversation. I recommend practicing a conversation. Maybe you're going to use your camera on your phone or hop on a Zoom meeting by yourself and record yourself. Or you could also have that conversation with someone else and look for some feedback on ways that you could, manage some parts of the conversation that are tricky or, set it up for a little bit more success. Highly recommend making some notes for yourself as well that you could refer to during the conversation. When possible, using I statements. So when I'm running late and I hit traffic, I feel stressed. Not, you're never on time for our meetings and it really sucks. It makes me feel like you don't respect me, right? So we want to think about framing it as an I statement. And where possible, as Brene Brown says, setting ourselves up for these conversations as you and me against the problem, as opposed to you against me. Another important piece is following and using healthy work habits. Now, when I offer wellness workshops or when I'm consulting with companies about their workplace strategy, these are issues that we talk about a lot because they can have a really big impact on mental well-being in the workplace. An important piece is seeking clarity on deliverables and expectations. So making sure you really understand what the deadlines are and what's expected of you. Asking follow-up questions if you're not clear and making sure that you've really got that understanding. When you're working, doing your best to avoid multitasking and focusing on one item at a time. I know how difficult that can be with, notifications coming in through our emails and, on our cell phones. But that's one of the reasons why it's helpful to silence notifications where you can. And in your day, maybe set aside some time to come back and check email, check Twitter, things like that, so that they're not constantly interrupting. Because an interesting fact about our bodies and our brains is that we respond to a Twitter notification or an email notification at the same level of intensity that we would respond to a saber-toothed tiger walking into the room. And we all know that probably whatever's in that email, in that notification, is not going to be that level of a threat, but our brain gets that heightened alert system. And then it makes it harder for us to focus on the work at hand. We need to do more work to bring ourselves back. So where possible, focusing on one thing at a time and silencing those notifications when you can. You also want to try and work at a steady and reasonable pace and take regular breaks where you're not checking your phone, where you're not looking at email, where you're just, sitting and having a cup of coffee or a glass of water and thinking, about something completely unrelated to work. It's a great way to reset both your stress level as well as your mental bandwidth for your work. So I wanted to talk a bit about the role of mental health at work. Now, mental health at work is not just for folks who have mental health concerns or mental illnesses, and it doesn't just talk about bullying and harassment, but rather it's the way that the workplace impacts everyone who's there. It includes whether the workplace is a helpful place, a neutral place, or a harmful place to the individuals that work there. So in the same way that we have physical health and safety in our workplace, there's also an element of mental health and safety in our workplaces. Mental health matters because it has a huge impact on your business. It impacts productivity, it impacts worker interactions, it impacts bandwidth, and really every element of how your team shows up every day. And this is really one of those categories of things where we address it in the beginning or we deal with the problems later on. It also, shows up in the way that our workplace culture is either a connect or a disconnect from the way we talk about culture and the way the culture is experienced. So I think we've probably all had that experience of a workplace where they describe their culture, usually before you start working there. And it sounds like a great place to work, really supportive environment. And then you get there and that's really not the case. So I call that the workplace culture disconnect. And what we want to do is identify and eliminate the things that are happening either underneath the surface or behind the scenes or subconsciously, usually not intentionally, that are causing that disconnect so that people don't feel supported and like they matter at your workplace. It's also the case that fear and uncertainty make things so much worse when we're talking about mental health. Right now, we are at a tricky place where we're navigating, the impacts of COVID-19, new restrictions that to help minimize spread, as well as the disruption of our routines, not just our normal pre-COVID routines, but also the ones that we've gotten used to in the interim with all of those things changing now. We're also facing an economic slowdown, which has a huge impact on people's stress levels. And so between all of that, we're seeing people with more stress, more risk of burnout, and just a lower mental bandwidth. So you really want to be thinking about mental health in your organization. So what's next? Ultimately, you want to have a plan that's going to have the most impact with the least effort, time, and money. Let's be honest. I mean, we want to get the most bang for our buck, and frankly, resources are tight these days. So what you want to do to work through that is making the business case in your organization of why a mental health strategy is important. I've got a video on my website at www.brandypayne.ca. About a 15-minute video walks through the business case, so feel free to give that a check out. There's also an issue of communicating with the team, letting folks know what's going on, why it's important to be addressing mental health, and some of the things that as an organization you're going to be doing to support them. Highly recommend taking a survey and finding out where your team is at now. So identifying what the big concerns are, what the smaller concerns are, where the areas for improvement are, and where you're doing things great. It also helps to look through some of the data you've got in terms of leaves, HR use, benefits usage, things like that. And then from there, you want to make a plan based on where your team is at today. And then start implementing that plan, giving people some supports, the tools that they need to support their own mental health, as well as identifying and eliminating some of those challenges that might be existing underneath the surface or happening kind of subconsciously. So I wanted to share a couple of tools that I recommend for organizations. These are all free, which is pretty awesome. So when you're looking at a survey, it's a bit of a longer engagement, dives a little bit deeper into how people are doing. guardingmindsatwork.ca has a really fantastic survey for workplaces. It's a bit long. It takes about 20 minutes to take the survey, but it comes out with a really comprehensive report and a lot of really great information about where you should focus your efforts and where some of the high risk areas are, and also the areas where you're doing great. Another option is to take a bit of a pulse check. So you want to look at tools that are able to provide quick information about how your team is doing, anonymized reports. So we're not looking at Jane in finance is struggling with depression, but more like an overarching thing of how your team's doing, as well as where maybe some potential areas of concern are. Ideally, there's also some information that individuals can use for their own mental well-being. Guarding Minds at Work, again, they have a stress satisfaction scan, which is a shorter engagement survey, 6 or 7 questions, really good for that little snapshot pulse check. And then I also recommend a few personal assessments. So these are ones that you would do as an individual just to kind of see how your own well-being is doing. The Canadian Mental Health Association has some really great ones off their national website. The work-life balance quiz is really great for kind of getting that sense of where you personally are at in terms of your work and your personal life balance. And the mental health meter is really good for kind of a snapshot on some of the common areas for mental health. So recommend checking those ones out. To learn more, I invite you to go to my website and download the workbook that I was talking about earlier. It's got links to all the resources I talked about, as well as some worksheets to go through identifying stressors, preparing for conversations, things like that. So you can find that at brandypayne.ca/Cybera. Also, if you're wondering about next steps for your organization or want to find out more about workshops or building a mental health plan, and beating stress and burnout at your workplace, I put the link for my calendar app in there. So feel free to hop on over there. You can also get that at the page where you can download the workbook. I'll also pop all that in the chat so it's easier to access. And with that, I look forward to any questions that you might have.